Hey, what's up everybody? Uncle Unit here, and before we get into today's stories, I wanted to let you guys know that I have created a second YouTube channel called Uncle Unit, and on this new channel, I'm going to be doing mask reviews, I'm going to be doing horror film reviews, Q&A videos, and generally just more horror-related content with more of a personal touch. So if you guys want to check that out, I'll leave a link below in the description. I've been feeling the need to branch out for a while now, and this new channel will give me that opportunity. And also, hopefully, it'll give you guys the opportunity to know me a little bit more. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Hopefully I see you guys there. Again, link will be down in the description for that. And I'll shut up now. Enjoy today's stories.
When I was a kid, my family moved into a house in the suburbs of Ottawa, Ontario. It was a pretty normal residential neighborhood with houses on each side of the street. There was a neighbor that stood out from the rest. When my dad went across the street to introduce himself, he immediately got a strange vibe. She barely spoke and wouldn't open the door more than a crack. She seemed very secluded and shy, and she didn't even give her name, so we ended up calling her Crazy Lady. One day I was playing outside with my brothers. We were having fun, but there was this overwhelming feeling that somebody was watching us. I tried not to think about it too much, but suddenly I heard a knocking sound on a window from the house across the street. I look over at the crazy lady's house. She was standing in front of her window watching us playing in our driveway. We made eye contact for a moment, and I quickly looked away, wondering why she was just standing there watching us. I was also wondering how many times she had done this, and we just hadn't noticed. I went inside and told my parents, but they said not to worry about it. It seemed that every time we were outside, I noticed her standing in her front window. She never smiled or waved, just stared. The only time she would ever speak to us was when a ball or something else we were playing with rolled into her driveway, and we had to go fetch it. She would come outside and almost immediately start yelling at us, telling us to get off her property. Fast forward about 5 years, and my neighbor finally disappears. It was as if, one night, she just up and left. No one in my family was sorry to see her go. But even when she left, that wasn't the end of it. One night not long after, we heard sirens outside of our house. The fire department and paramedics had all gathered outside the crazy lady's home. My mom went over to them and tried to explain that the house was empty, but they responded that they had received a call from a medical alert necklace at that address. We all went back to sleep, assuming something had gotten mixed up and they just ended up at the wrong address. Eventually, a new family moved into the house. We all went over to introduce ourselves, and we got to talking about the woman who used to live there. They seemed confused and told us that they had owned that property for many years, and no one, at least according to them, was supposed to be living there. Eventually, through their oldest son, my family and I learned two things later on. Upon re-entering the house, there had been a single chair facing the window in front of the living room, and that no one could remember leaving it there. Second, down in the basement, there was a small room, more of a storage space really. It was locked from the inside, and the family couldn't access it. The parents never remembered it being locked or requiring a key. To the best of my knowledge, they never got access to the space. But I couldn't help but wonder, even years later, if the remains of that old woman were down there, behind that locked door. When I was 17, I worked on my grandfather's horse ranch in Colorado. This was back in the late 80s, when throwing the football around and drinking were all there was to do, when I wasn't cleaning out the barn or feeding the horses. At the time, both my father and my grandfather were well known throughout the community as being upstanding people, and it seemed as though everyone who encountered them in town was on a first-name basis with them. As a result, that made me well known during social gatherings as well. I don't remember the exact date, but it was late November or early December of '88. I was horseback riding deep through the backwoods with my cousin Roy. It was the furthest we had ever traveled back into our family's property, and we were enjoying the sensation of exploring a new place. I was focusing mostly on the compass because I didn't want to get lost, but Roy was scanning the tree line for new landmarks and anything interesting worth investigating. I wasn't expecting him to find anything, so I nearly fell off my saddle when he pointed out what appeared to be an RV parked amongst the trees. We made our way towards it on the horses, and discovered it to be one of those old-fashioned truck RV campers that had its own power supply. It wasn't really parked on a dirt road or anything. It was more of an open avenue between the trees wide enough to fit through. I had no idea which direction the closest road was. My very first thought was that it had to be abandoned, but the closer we got, the more obvious it became that it was in pretty good shape. Almost new, I would say. I stepped down off of my horse and knocked on the door. I was curious to know if someone was living out here on our property and therefore trespassing, or if it belonged to the 24 or so people my grandfather knew from town, and most likely I would know them as well. After knocking several times, I tried the handle to discover that it was locked. Now the practical thing would have been to note our position and head back home, and ask our family if they knew what it was. But we were teenagers and had no common sense. We wanted to explore further, and went to the far side and discovered the window opposite the door was cracked. I pulled it halfway open and peered inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was like a wave of burnt bacon mixed in with stale tobacco. Roy jokingly asked me if I found any bodies in there as I peered around. It was late in the morning and the sun was high, and even though there weren't any lights on in the camper, I could see well enough by the light peeking through the cracks in the window blinds. There was a couch, a small table, some ugly carpeting, and about 3 different ashtrays at least. "Hello?" I called out. I stated my name. After a few moments of silence, I concluded that there was no one there. I peered my head further in to get a better look. I saw a tiny kitchen area with a sink, countertop, and cabinets. I was about to pull my head back out when I noticed something. One of the cabinet doors was ajar, and I could see something large and bulky was preventing it from shutting. I stared at it hard. I then walked out into the woods and found the longest stick I could easily carry, and walked back. "What is it?" I didn't answer him, and carefully extended the stick into the camper. After a few close scrapes on the cabinet door, I managed to knock it open a bit wider. My stomach sank, and my heart started racing. I pulled the stick back and turned to my cousin. "What does that look like to you in the cabinet?" I pointed. I didn't tell him what I thought it was. I wanted to see if he identified it as the same thing I did at first glance. Roy peered inside and stared for about 3 seconds. "Shit. I don't know what that is." "But what does it look like?" I insisted. Roy was silent for another few moments, and then jumped back from the window. "Holy shit, is that a head? Like a human head?" I peered in again. What the thing in the cabinet definitely looked like was a human head lying on its left ear, facing the back of the cabinet, so all I could really see was the dark hair and the right ear. I couldn't see the neck very well, as it was still out of sight behind the cabinet door. "No way that's real." Roy tried to laugh. I wanted to agree with him, but the cold pit in my stomach wasn't letting me. Something about the hair had that disheveled look, and the skin was a clammy white, and there was this rotten meat smell from inside. "Well, what else could it be?" I remember asking Roy. I wanted him to say something ridiculously obvious that it might have been, but he only shrugged. I picked up the stick again, and stuck it through the window for a second time. I wanted to physically poke at it so I could get a better sense of what it was. I leaned in as far as I could and caught the cabinet's edge with the stick, and tried to swing it further open. That's when a cold hand grabbed my arm, and knocked the stick out of my grip. I only remember the next few moments as a blur. I can recall the feeling of an intense shock, and jerking my arm backwards. I caught a glimpse of a bare-chested, bearded man. I wrenched my arm back as hard as I could, and was surprised when he let go of it casually. But the thing that made me most horrified in that moment wasn't seeing the man's face, but catching a glimpse of what appeared to be a second head on a shelf at the far side of the camper over the man's shoulder. I yelled at Roy to run to the horses, and we both mounted up and rode out of there as fast as we could. I recall hearing the camper door swing open hard, and the sound of a rifle being fired. We didn't look back for several minutes, until we were in a familiar area. We then slowed down and changed direction as we made our way back to the house. Roy and I immediately encountered my father coming down the stairs as we sprinted into the house. We told him everything, possible decapitated head and all. I'll never forget the look on my father's face. He didn't seem surprised or alarmed, only annoyed. He told us to get the horses back in the barn and that no one was to call the police. He would handle it himself. With our adrenaline still racing, Roy and I returned the horses to the barn and made our way back to the house. My dad made us wait in the living room for our grandfather to come home. And when he did, the four of us sat down at the dining room table and had a long talk. My grandfather looked us both dead in the eye and said if we ever spoke about this to anyone, we would be denied our inheritance of the ranch. We never discussed it again beyond that point, but Roy and I still talked about it plenty. We even rode out there a week later to see if the camper was still there, but it was gone. We followed the wheel marks for over 3 miles of bush and leaves. We tracked it to a dirt road, where we lost the trail. My grandfather died in 2003, and my father recently passed away of heart failure earlier this year. Given our inheritance is secure, I finally decided to write about this experience, because the memory has been haunting me for years. Roy and I speculate that my father and grandfather knew the man that was out there, and even had their permission to be there. But when we stumbled across him and he shot at us, everything changed, and he was driven off of the property. Had my father just blown it off and told us we were crazy, I may have slept better that night, but the fact that we were threatened into silence made me think that the matter was deadly serious, and maybe those heads we saw were real. I feel in my bones that my family helped shelter a dangerous man and potentially cover up his crimes. I feel something may be unearthed one day that will come back to haunt us. I would like to start off by saying that if it wasn't for me stumbling upon this channel and getting royally freaked out by all the scary stories, I don't think my children and I would still be here today. A few weeks ago, on a Saturday morning, my kids and I were all sitting around the breakfast table enjoying some pancakes. My husband is doing his usual rushing around, getting ready for work because he had overslept yet again. As we were saying our goodbyes, I reminded him that the kids and I were going to the local splash pad for the afternoon. I never used to lock the doors to the backyard, because it was fenced in with a locked gate, so I didn't see the need. Today though, I locked it out of paranoia, because I had kinda gotten spooked from watching a Unit 522 video the night before. Even though a break-in was highly unlikely, I suddenly didn't feel like tempting fate and challenging a burglar. I got to doing chores around the house when I noticed it was raining outside. Figuring the splash pad was no longer an option, I left the room and tried to find an activity that would keep the kids occupied, and we ended up building a couch fort. After a short while, I got up and returned to the laundry room to check the machine. As I was preparing a new load, I noticed our back gate was wide open. I thought it was strange. Even with the wind, the lock should have held. The thought had barely finished forming in my head when my daughter came rushing into the kitchen and said, "Mommy, there's a man at the window. He waved at me." Feeling confident that my daughter's imaginative mind was playing tricks on her, I followed her back into the living room. My heart then stopped. On the other side of the window was a very dirty man, wearing a black tattered leather jacket. He had long, oily hair. He wasn't even trying to be discreet, and was staring directly into our house. He had his eyes on my son, who was sitting in the middle of the living room. "Hey, what are you doing? Get the hell out of my garden!" I shouted at him. He gave me the biggest, most malicious smile. In his right hand, he lifted a very large, bloody kitchen knife. Adrenaline and panic kicked in, and I grabbed my son and my daughter as calmly as I could. I took them upstairs and told them that we were playing a game of hide and seek, and that they needed to hide in the wardrobe and stay quiet. My daughter had enough sense to know that we were hiding from the man outside, but I assured her that the man was a friend, and she didn't have to worry. I walked back downstairs. I opened a closet door, grabbed a baseball bat, and held it over my head, ready to swing at anything. I went back to the living room window where the man had been standing. He was gone, but he left a bloody handprint on the glass. I grabbed my phone and called the police. After explaining the situation, they told me they would have an officer over as soon as possible. The officer arrived in a matter of minutes, and I showed him the bloody handprint on the window. He went outside to investigate. While he was doing that, I got my kids out from my bedroom. I sat them down and let them watch cartoons while I spoke to the officer. and he informed me that there were bloody fingerprints on my back door handle. The guy had been trying to get in. The next few hours were a blur. The officer called somebody out to take samples of the blood. They took my statement, and my husband took the rest of the day off to be with us. The officer contacted me and said they had arrested the man who was in the back garden. Apparently, the man had done the exact same thing to another family just 2 days after it happened to me. The blood on the window had been his own. According to the police, the guy had been recently released from a mental institution and had not been taking his medication. God only knows what he would have done to us if he had managed to get in. Maybe his intention was only to scare us, but maybe it was something far worse. I truly believe that Unit 522's channel saved me and my children that day. If it wasn't for my paranoia due to watching his videos, I think the outcome would have been completely different.
There's always a reason to be afraid.